Greetings. Welcome to Beatles Stuffology, where two old friends sit about and talk BS, Beatles stuff, on a track-by-track basis, pretty much for the sake of it. My name is McQuarrie, and I'm here with my co-host, Andrew Deacon. Say hi, Andrew.
Hello, JG. How are you today?
I am doing all right, thank you, today. How are you doing today?
I'm okay. I'm conflicted because I've been told by our esteemed editor that perhaps we were a bit lacking in enthusiasm for the episode of "Can't Buy Me Love," and yet actually, I think I've got a bit of sickness, which is worrying me. I've got a touch of second side sickness. So, dear listener, we are starting on the second side of Hard Day's Night, and it sort of occurred to me this obviously this is the third Beatles album that we're doing, and on all three so far, we've sort of flipped the disc and then hit a bunch of songs where I think you just kind of go, okay, okay, fair enough. And I think it's my mentality, whereby so the first half of a play, really enjoy, absolutely fantastic, and then get to the interval, and the second half is always more disappointing. You think, okay, now all the plot's going to evolve, the characters are going to develop, and there's normally just a rush to get through things. And I think we've got to admit, in our heart of hearts, side two of both Beatles albums so far is a little bit. They're both a little bit disappointing.
I don't think that's an unfair judgment at all. Although, for those of us more inclined of a science fiction basis, we would call that the Star Trek The Next Generation two-parter syndrome, where the first part tends to be great and the second part never really quite manages to convince in the same sort of way. But yeah, we're flipping over the disc and we're tackling side two of A Hard Day's Night. And that means that we have all the, shall we say pleasure? Yeah, let's go with pleasure. All the pleasure of covering any time at all. But just before we do that, it's our favorite section of the show, whereby if you also agree with us that we were a bit lackluster and lacking in enthusiasm when it comes to Can't Buy Me Love, oh, seamless transitions, how I love you so, then you can really get a hold of us. And you can contact us by email. We are BeatlesStuffology@gmail.com. We're on Twitter at Beatles_ology, and you can find my blog at www.jgmcquarrie.scot, and you can find Andrew's blog at www.stuffology.co.uk. So yeah, get in touch with us and just tell us how terribly lackadaisical we were when it came to the previous episode. But let's instead now focus on this one. So, what are your feelings towards this one?
Well, again, the usual caveat of even a half decent Beatles song is better than a very good song by insert name of most other bands. Um, but I wonder if this song is something that we can officially title as one of the top 100 Beatles songs. For it is in the top 100 Beatles songs of all time, Beatley songy type thing, at number 96 on according to Rolling Stone magazine, which is quite exciting. Until when you sort of look at the other ones at the top or the bottom, as it were, of that 100, number 100 being Hello Goodbye, which I quite like. 99 being Yes It Is, which I don't really know. Number 98, Long Long Long, which I do like in a weird kind of way. And then 97, All I've Got to Do, which I really do like. And then we have Any Time at All, which seems a slightly kind of odd placing. And it does claim in the little write-up that comes with it, says never a hit, Any Time became a fan favourite. I don't know about you, but I've known a few Beatles fans in my time, but I've not heard anyone discuss it as being a fan favourite. And also, if it is a fan favourite, how come it's at number 96?
Well, fan favorite and well-written song aren't necessarily synonyms of each other. It can still be a fan favorite and not be a necessarily great song, just well enjoyed. But I don't think it would crack my top 100 if I'm being honest. I don't know. It's I mean the point you were making about the second side being a step down from the first side, both on this album and the last one, I think is worth taking a look at, simply because obviously everything for the first side of this was written with a very specific purpose, and everything on the second side of this well, I was going to say isn't, but that's not quite accurate. It is. It's just that the purpose is fill up the album rather than, provide these songs for this movie you're doing. And you can tell that the sort of creative jolt, I think, that runs through the first side of this album, um, is really what animates it. They've got drive, they've got ambition, they want to be able to do this, and I think that's reflected in the quality of the songwriting. Even the songs which are comparatively sort of, I mean, none of them are really tossed away, but I'm happy just to dance with you is probably the weakest of them, and it's still fine. Whereas when we flip it over and we kind of get through side two, I mean, we're not going into great detail at this point, but there's one straightforward classic, and then there's the rest of the side, and that's kind of it. And this is not the one which I would qualify as a straightforward classic. It's fine. It's got some energy to it. It's got a bit of pep. It's got a little bit of spark to it, but it doesn't quite have the same animating spirit or feeling of unity that I think you get from the songs in the first side.
So I think evidence to support your point of view, for those of the Spotify generation, I am holding up now a copy of the vinyl, not original, version of A Hard Day's Night. And as some of you may know, Tony Barrow wrote sleeve notes for the first few albums. And quite often he would have written sort of like little vignettes about each of the songs, which he does do on side one, admittedly not in huge detail. But then when we get to side two, it's almost like a justification about why they're including these songs that weren't in the film itself. And he manages to basically cover all of the songs in, I think, two sentences. So, for the main part, well, the whole thing says Paul handles the lyrics of things we said today, and he's heard in duet with John on I'll Cry Instead. End sentence. For the main part, John is the dominant voice featured on Any Time at All, When I Get Home, You Can't Do That, and I'll Be Back, although George and Paul back up his efforts strongly on all titles. There you go. That's his summation of the individual songs on side two. And there's a fair point to that. I mean, Ian MacDonald refers to this as being a song that was just basically knocked off either in Paris or New York, as in effectively a song that was written really, really quickly, and probably not developed all that much either, recorded towards the end of the sessions. And you do get the feeling that it is something that was there in order to fill up the album, to be able to have something of album length in order to be able to put out. So, in terms of the evidence of that, I would maybe offer the fact that, in my mind, the most memorable part of this is the chorus, the verses. I just don't think they really have any kind of punch at all, and yet the chorus is something that grabs. And I've written a note that I need to ask you about. And I'm just going to sort of bring my notes back up here because I think this is something that we really ought to discuss, because I can't remember why I wrote this. Here we go. Here's my question for you, JG. What is that guitar solo?
Um, Other than weak, I would suggest that what that guitar solo is another instance of finding a way to cover up something which is a bit perfunctory. Which is to say, it's one of those solos where you have George Martin playing piano in the background, and then George Harrison playing the same line over the top of it, and then the two are mixed together to give a slightly, for the time, unconventional kind of sound to it. It's not wholly convincing, I think it's fair to say. I mean, it's not a disaster. It works well enough, I suppose. On the Wikipedia page, and I think it's also in the Beatles Bible as well. It's pointed out that by the time this song was ready for mixing, the middle eight didn't have any words to it, and so that's how it is on the actual finished song. It's just unfinished. That detail of the guitar solo obviously takes a little bit more time than just, oh bugger it, we're done. But not an awful lot more time than that, if the truth be told. It's funny, overall the guitars in this kind of on this song are not great, and yet it's got that lovely little final chord, which I assume is I think it's Lennon because it's an electric guitar rather than a 12 string or a classical. And it just brings the song to a lovely little close. But overall, there's a lot that's a little bit indistinct about this song, and I think that speaks to how much time was invested in it, which is to say, not all that much.
Yeah, I mean, I would yeah, I would wholeheartedly agree. I quite like the 12 string on it. I
Yep.
think it sort of works. It's quite affecting, um, but it's just not one that lives that long in the memory. It is that case of written quickly, recorded reasonably quickly. I don't know what, 8 takes, something like that. And it does sort of make you wonder just how much better it could have been if the Beatles had taken a little bit more time to record, if the modus operandi had been to slave over albums in the way that some people may do these days. Although even then, you suspect that actually what probably would have happened is that they would have combined 2 albums worth of material, and a song like this perhaps would have got lost for something else that had come along for, say, I don't know, Beatles for Sale. So I don't necessarily think this is a song that they would have completely honed until it was perfect, because I think there's probably a limit to just how good it can actually be. But I do think that one of the reasons why this album is unusual is because it's so dominated by John, and that means that some of these songs are going to be stretched a little. Some of the quality of the album is perhaps going to be stretched a little. If you bear in mind that on the albums around it, there are covers to make up the detail. And also, when you get into the later albums, you're really talking about the Beatles having to come up with, I don't know what, 4 songs a year per person, 5 songs a year per person. And that helps with the quality. So yeah, they were producing some brilliant albums later on because they were, having 2.5 songwriters in the band meant that they didn't have to slave over, say Ray Davis, trying to slave over 12 songs for an album effectively on his own, or Richards and Jagger having to slave over 12 songs an album on their own. So, having that kind of split role, I think, is really important in that respect. But it does mean that because the emphasis is on more on Lennon here, whether that's because McCartney didn't have the songs, they certainly didn't seem to make them into the studio, or whether it's just he was the more dominant voice, I don't know. But there's a bit more pressure on him, which means that there are some really high highs, and there are some kind of more middling elements as well. And I'd say this is sort of stuck somewhere in between the high highs and the middling elements. It's not there with I'm Happy Just to Dance with You, but it's not also, if you like, in my opinion, up there with I Should Have Known Better, which I still think is a real grower on this album.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is a really important point in terms of the number of songs that any one individual had to produce, and the fact that this song went without a middle eight simply because the words weren't ready in time for it to be recorded. I mean, that in and of itself speaks to exactly what you're talking about. It is that fact that it was just too much material. He just didn't get round to writing the middle eight. So, well, it's not there then. It's just an instrumental package, part rather, and that's fine. But I think also there's a sloppiness to this song as well, which is at least a little bit unusual. Partly, I think that comes down to that you mentioned the music in the verse earlier on. It's a kind of fairly lazy kind of shift between B minor, D, and A, and it is for the chorus, which gives a bit of pep, but then you're kind of sinking back into kind of like F sharp minors, B minors, G minors for the verse. It's all kind of fairly uninspired stuff, and the recording of the actual vocal as well, which is double tracked, but really double tracked again in a very kind of sloppy sort of way. So you can hear when Lennon comes in quite late on some of it, or you can hear where he slightly mistimes stuff or whatever. They haven't gone back to re-record it. They haven't gone back to fix any of the mistakes with punch-ins or whatever, and it's just kind of left hanging out there, and it never seems like it's something it's deliberate. He's not harmonizing with himself. He's just double tracking his own vocal, but not particularly well. And that lends a slightly sloppy feel to the song, which is, I mean, it's unusual for how tightly the Beatles are generally produced, but it also slightly works against the material. That this song needs to be sharper, and sometimes that sloppiness can really add to the feeling of a song. A lot of Ringo songs are quite sloppily recorded. Like Boys, for example, but that adds to the charm. Whereas here, it actively detracts from it. And yeah, again, it's just that feeling that there's just like nobody's all that invested in this song, and that kind of feels like a shame. So yeah, there is definitely that side of it. But yeah, there's just it's a lot for one person to produce, and you can't get everything right.
It's interesting that, I mean, MacDonald has this down as being recorded on the 27th of February in '64, and yet they were still recording songs, admittedly after touring, still recording songs for it in April and then again in June. So there wasn't that urge to go back and to perfect anything. It's like it's done, it's good enough. Let's go. Let's move on to something else. And recorded in the same session as "If I Fell" as well. So there's quite a little contrast there as to why they might really sort of go for something a little bit more polished on one and not the other. But it's also worth, I mean, I've referred to both the Rolling Stones, 100 greatest Beatles songs and MacDonald. There's sort of a contrast in the way both write about them. That's not exactly uncommon, is it? So when MacDonald's writing about it, he's talking about the an unhappy sentiments of it. Okay, so the unhappy sentiments there. Whereas the Rolling Stone article talks about the pledge of 24-hour devotion to a girl, with Lennon speaking his mind in a brash way that would have made Buddy Holly proud. I think, okay, well that's interesting. So it's open-hearted, and it's got unhappy sentiments. Yeah. Take your pick, really. So basically, I think what we're saying is, whatever your opinion of this song and its focus, you can find someone who can agree with your views.
Out of curiosity, how recent is that Rolling Stone article? Is it something comparatively recent,
Well,
or because
uh, that's a really good question, and I've done a copy and paste into a document because, frankly, I don't know if you've been on Rolling Stone's website, but every time I go on it, it basically does horrible things to my computer and it crashes the browser, mostly because of its ideological attachment to random adverts. This was published in, I've just loaded up just for you. So if you lose the call, you'll know why. Oh, there you go. There goes Chrome. Let's try that again one last time. April 2020.
okay, that's very interesting. Yeah. Huh. Okay. Good. Yeah. It's one of the things that I think the way that people talk about the Beatles has shifted so much since Revolution in the Head was published. It is such a key text, such an important part of Beatles analysis, but there's been so much water under the bridge since Ian McDonald's book was published that it
Yeah,
sometimes can't help but feel not reactionary, that's not quite the right word, but it feels a bit kind of it's just clearly first wave of that kind of criticism, capital C criticism, which is directed at the Beatles. And there's been so much material which has been written since, and I don't mean this in any way to sound disrespectful, but often better as well. But so much of what has been written subsequently needs to have Revolution in the Head there as that kind of foundation on which a lot of the sort of second and third wave kind of Beatles criticism is built upon. And I think those kind of differences where you have, like, say, for example, the Rolling Stone article focusing on one side of the lyric and McDonald focusing on the other. I think that's one of the ideal kind of examples on it, because really, ideally, if you want to take a piece of criticism which is going to address the song, then what you want to be able to do is to be able to keep going with both sides of that and then kind of reach one kind of conclusion. Both of those feel relatively slight in terms of their analysis. What you need is something which will bring them together. In the case of Rolling Stone, that's understandable because it's Rolling Stone. But there are so many Beatles books which can achieve so much more than that now. So I think it is interesting to kind of bear in mind the different periods in which these kind of critiques are being written.
Well, if we're going to delve into the realms of historiography, there, JG, it's also worth considering the brand new form of criticism in the form of, I don't know if you've heard of them, these podcasts. There's quite a few of these podcasts around.
Hmm.
And they offer new and interesting insights into the world of the Beatles. Obviously we're just a small part of that, but there are a fair few really interesting podcasts who are diving into those details and critiquing Ian MacDonald in a way that perhaps he wouldn't have considered possible himself, because obviously he's putting forward his text as being authoritative, and having been a writer for NME, perhaps he might challenge the assertion that poor humble personages such as us would have an opinion alongside an esteemed journalist with all their journalistic contacts. But yeah, here we are.
Well, there's a reason we start at the top of this show is describing ourselves as being full of BS, so that's fine. I mean, it is one of those things in the way that the this is going to sound incredibly pretentious, so I apologize in advance. But the democratization of opinion that podcasts allow, it does mean that a lot of the kind of conventional wisdom can be challenged. Now that can be incredibly valuable, especially I think one of the great things about listening to, quite a few Beatles podcasts is that they tend to be very, when I say supportive, I don't mean supportive of each other, but there's a generally a very goodwill towards both the band and towards other people's opinions. So it's possible to have disagreement or alternative perspectives without it just becoming like a typical internet slanging match. And I think that's incredibly pleasing. It's one of the reasons I really like listening to other Beatles podcasts. But I think it also helps to show up certain limitations. So if you take something like Ian MacDonald, like one of the two things, well, I would say the two things that make that book seem very old fashioned now. One is the general hostility towards George Harrison, and two is the general hostility towards Yoko Ono. Both of those things feel very much of the 90s. They feel like something that sort of Beatles criticism has long moved past at this point. George Harrison can be acknowledged as a good guitarist and a good songwriter, even if he wasn't always. And the whole Yoko thing is, we're just past that now. And I really love the fact that podcasts have kind of helped to disseminate that as points of view and to challenge the kind of the orthodoxy of those kind of things from critics like Ian MacDonald. And I don't mean that to sound derogatory. Like, you couldn't have a lot of the work which has come subsequently without him. I mean, you have Lewisham as well, and that's a whole chunk of criticism and analysis, which is a whole separate conversation. But I think it's really heartening the way that these discussions can carry on, and that I mean, you and I are still doing it. Plenty of other people are still doing it, and it's all rather joyful, really.
Yeah, I mean, the Big Beatles sort out is an interesting one, because they're currently doing the singles and B-sides of the fact by the time this episode goes out, they would have finished doing that series on the singles and B-sides of the Beatles in their solo capacity, in particular in the 70s. Um, and I think if at the moment they've still got a Yoko Ono song in the top 10. And they were surprised, having gone through that process of listening to all of those, actually just how good some of Yoko Ono's material actually is, which it's fair enough. I mean, I only remember listening to, my nan had double fantasy and not really being able at age of 8, 9, 10 to be able to access that material in any way, shape, or form. So that's something that perhaps I should go back and have a look at. And certainly that series has been interesting for introducing me to a whole load of George Harrison releases, singles and B-sides, of which I wasn't aware, mostly because they didn't sell and, he wasn't perhaps as lauded. So, it's useful that people are finding a way to go back and to review those materials, even if I do vehemently disagree with them on the quality of Ding Dong, which frankly I think is a masterpiece. So Big Beatles sort out, if you're listening to this, go back, reappraise your view of Ding Dong. Not only is it by far the best New Year's Eve song ever, I'd say it's yeah, I'd say it's possibly up there with any of the Beatles' festive songs, but that's controversy for another day. And do you know what all of this tells us? This diversion into historiography and the like. It tells us that we really don't have much more to say about this song, do we?
I don't think that we probably do. So shall we just give it go and wrap this up before we manage to wander completely off piste?
So yeah, I mean, I think it's fair to say that it's perfectly fine. And for any of our listeners who've been playing JG Bingo, we've had pep, perfunctory, and pretentious. So we've almost certainly had all the P's that were on your scorecard, folks.
Excellent. I'm very happy that you've been keeping track. That just makes me full of joy and happiness. Right, what are you giving this one?
I don't know. It's going to be a 6, isn't it? Because and actually worth pointing out that when we get to the end of this album, we've started talking about going back and reappraising. So I'm scoring it how it fits in with some of the other songs at the moment. But I suspect if I come to reappraise it and think again about the fact that we've got scores out of 10, because I suspect I'm gonna try and argue in favour of scores out of 10 being, with 0 being the worst Beatles song and 10 being the best Beatles song, which is criteria that we've not really discussed. I suspect it's going to more be like 4 or 5 under the reframed scoring system. However, at the moment, it sits quite comfortably alongside several of those other 6 out of 10 songs.
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm going to give it as well. I think it's all right. It's fine. It's got a bit of energy to kick off side 2, but there's not an awful lot more to it than what it is. It's fine. It's a bit sloppy, but let's see, what else did I give 6 to? I'm happy just to dance with you, this boy. Roll over Beethoven, a little child. Yeah, oh yeah, that works. Yeah, I'm fine with that. 6 out of 10 for me as well.
We are agreed.
Yeah, well, yeah, it's a minor miracle. Right, good. Well, just to repeat what we said at the top of the show, you can get a hold of us at BeatlesStuffology@gmail.com, Twitter at Beatles_ology, and you can find my blog at www.jgmcquarrie.scot and Andrews at stuffology.co.uk. Please also check out my other podcast, which is Talking Trek to You, where a noob and an expert, me apparently, go through the original Star Trek series episode by episode. Please like, rate, and review us on whatever podcatcher you're using so that more people can find the show, because we love people being able to find the show. Although saying that, you might not want to for the next episode, because the next episode is going to be I'll Cry Instead. But
no, I've got loads of brilliant stuff for the next episode. It's going to be fantastic.
I've been corrected. All right, definitely tune in for the next episode, folks, regardless of the quality of the material that we're discussing, because Andrew's got lots to say about it. That's a good enough reason for anyone. So we'll wrap it up there, and until then, keep listening.